Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of Meris's webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about the year in preview, the FY24 preview. Obviously, we've already started, but this is a look at the year ahead and what we're all going to have to do this year to keep up the pace of change in the industry. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. But I also acknowledge that the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all working today around Australia, and all of the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders who are participating in this webinar today. So welcome. And thanks for taking the time. We'll have a jam-packed hour as usual. We've got 4 panelists, providers to talk about the theme today. Just a reminder that there is a CPD point available for this training. So if you're eligible for that, don't forget to claim it. Only the presenters are on camera and on microphones. So please get your questions in the chat. You could get a question responded to. We've got a team of people monitoring the chat to answer some questions if we can, but also we go over the chat at the end and make sure, maybe if there's some questions to feed in, if we've got time, we'll look at those questions, but otherwise we review it to look for ideas for future topics for these webinars. These webinars are free for everyone, and they're really designed to just inform the industry and share information and keep everybody informed for a sort of 1 hour investment a month. So the FY24, this is what we're going to talk about today. Before we get on to the rest, most of you responded to a poll. These poll questions are getting quite popular. Through over 300 responses we get to these quick polls, but also what's probably more important is there's over 150, 160 or 170 providers represented in this poll. So a fairly significant number of providers, even though it's only a couple of people from each one. But the first question, how concerned are you that too much change will take its toll on your team? So change fatigue over the next 12 months. And what's interesting is that it's quite high. Very concerned, just very concerned and extremely concerned alone are over 50%. So quite a high level of concern that this change is going to take its toll. That relates quite similarly to this next question, which is around how do you have the knowledge and the resources to actually achieve this change? I was talking to a provider this morning who said they have a full-time person working in an administrative role, basically, just trying to stay on top of the change and stay on top of the various pieces of documentation and administration that goes along with it. So, they're a bit of a larger organization. They can afford to have a person, but what are people doing in smaller businesses? This is just taking its toll on other people. But, 80% of people feel like they're going to need at least some help to a lot of help in both the knowledge areas and the actual capacity areas over the next 12 months. So that's a concern. And another sentiment question, how confident are you that these changes are actually going to improve outcomes for residents, which is what it's all supposed to be about? And I think what these results tell us with over 50%, nearly 60, 55% being moderately confident, slightly confident, or even the slightly confident and not confident, 40%. There's a lot of, the jury's out. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of change happening. It's having quite a big impact. All of you are very, very focused on outcomes for residents, of course, because that's the priority. That's why we're all here. But there's a lot of people who are waiting to see how, and a fairly significant don't know, not sure there as well. A lot of people waiting to see how this directly improves the outcomes for residents in the end. So that's an interesting sentiment question. So as usual, so FY24 in preview, what we tried to do last webinar is talk about financial sustainability specifically. So really budgets and finances and numbers and dollars. What we're trying to do in this webinar is broaden it out. So what's everything that's coming in the next 12 months? And what are the big things that should be concerning you, and the big things that you'll really need to continue to plan for? And I've been a strategy and change consultant for a long time. And, the most important thing about managing change is to is to do a little bit all the time, is to stay on top of it and keep it moving, rather than wait till things are due and do a lot of work in short periods of time. That usually creates a lot of stress and creates a lot of mistakes. So running at it from as far away as you can, if you can, if that's realistic, is what's important. But FY24 preview, we really want to have a look at a broad view. We're going to talk to the panelists in a couple of sessions today, and also we're going to have a look at the department's roadmap that they've released in the recent weeks. And if you're like most people, you've probably looked at it, but not that carefully. So we're going to have a little bit of a better look at it in the session today and talk through some of the things that might be particularly interesting there. And hopefully everyone will take away some ideas of things that they can think about and work on after this. So we're just going to start with some data now from Tyler, and looking at some of the really impactful pieces of the data and analysis that can frame up the conversation today. Tyler?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So as you said, today we're going to be assessing the outlook for the financial year 2024. And for this industry, this is the year of profitability. If that's too strong a word for you, then sustainability. If that's too strong, not operating at a loss. If that's too strong, then this year may mean what many facilities have faced recently, and that is selling or closing. There have been some major acquisitions recently, along with many more minor ones. We've also been hearing a lot lately about services closing. They're citing challenges brought on by heightened regulatory requirements and tightened subsidy margins. There's also huge numbers of services that are operating as smaller than the actual capacity of their facilities. And I'll talk about some of the market forces that are triggered by this supply and demand activity. But first, I want to get back to this notion of sustainability. And if we look at last year, there was a very heavy revenue focus. We had to establish a new classification mechanism. We reclassified many residents who had been shadow assessed long before. For most of the industry, this meant really widening an already significant care minute deficit. But there were several reasons to do it this way. One, it allowed us to realize the appropriate revenue entitlement for the largest subsidy increase ever seen at that time. Two, it required us to quickly adapt our processes and systems and strategies to start. Well, we had to start this learning curve that was really set out before us by the reforms. And I guess it also allowed us to get visibility of the case mix requirements of our residents based on accurate classifications. And this is maybe the most important aspect as we move forward into this new year, with our eyes really fixed on the 1st of October. And as Andrew mentioned, we are already 1 month in to the new financial year. And from the 1st of July, we have been realizing the largest subsidy increase ever seen, 9 months after the now second largest increase. And this has been compounded by all of the reassessment activity we identified over the past year. So along with a revenue boost and higher subsidies, we saw the care minute requirement jump up. And both of those are now stabilizing. I mean, obviously they are linked, so that they're stabilizing in unison. But what this means is we have a very clear picture of a steady revenue stream and the associated care minute requirement, which is really easily used as a proxy for cost. The NWOW price has been put way up this year as a way for the government to fulfill its promise to fund the Fair Work decision to increase the aged care award by 15%. This decision was meant to help the industry attract and retain skilled workers. The question facing most providers who were already paying above the award is, how much do I increase pay? With the objective to be as attractive to job seekers as possible, we need to understand the amount we can afford to increase. Again, that clear revenue and cost projection gives us the answer. The key variable in this analysis is, what is the sustainable operating result we can achieve? And an important consideration within this variable is that we cannot rely on Commonwealth funding to produce commercial margins for our business. In other words, there is no fat in care subsidy. This is by design. Linking cost requirements to subsidy entitlements was a direct takeaway from the Royal Commission, closing the loophole the industry benefited from in ACC. So, I mean, this really leads us to the next slide and the next iteration for the industry, which is accommodation payment arrangements. Some suggest that the only solution is a major overhaul of the current legislation. So RAD and DAP arrangements, means testing. The Commonwealth has shown that it will rely on the interests of non-government organizations to take on its own responsibilities. And so an $11 hotel supplement is the extent of any foreseeable adjustment. And so does this mean that there is no hope for care recipients to contribute more? The industry as a whole is well below the room price cap of $550,000. But even for services that have come to that ceiling, there is a clear path to pricing rooms higher. And there is no doubt that the demographic we service has the wealth and the propensity to pay. However, they are discerning and educated consumers, so want to expect, they want and expect to get their money's worth. As with care rosters, when we have a known cost basis, we can calculate the pricing schedule and sales targets required to keep the business going. So why were providers unable to price rooms at levels that generated adequate revenue to offset the associated costs? If we dust off our old Econ 101 textbook, we might diagnose some of the market forces that cause this shortfall, and more importantly, identify what is to come. So on the next slide, we'll see there is a chart at the bottom, and this is in the first chapter of every economics book there is. Increasing supply puts downward pressure on price. Decreasing supply increases price. The graph above is the number of beds in the industry from 2015 overlaid by the number of residents and the resulting occupancy level. As we know, industry occupancy declined steadily for several recent years. This was mostly caused by large, regular influxes of bed licenses and new infrastructure that we foresaw as being required to meet the coming demand. From 2015, that supply increased by 14%, and the total number of residents in care increased by only 9%. So with supply significantly outstripping demand, there was tremendous downward pressure on price. Combined with the capacity for ACC to subsidize other parts of the business, these market forces led to a very natural evolution, and the industry made margins on care and operated at a loss in accommodation. So for providers who have weathered the last 5+ years, the tide is turning. Attrition is buoying pricing, and the services leaving the industry are more often ones that are no longer fit for purpose. The remaining infrastructure is comprised of single occupancy rooms that our consumers demand. So what we'll look forward to this year, and what we'll talk a lot more about in the next webinar, is how each service really needs to understand the segment of the market they cater to and identify the true value the product they are bringing to market. But again, look for a lot of that content next month. For now, let's get some views from our panelists about their outlook for FY24. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ty. Thanks. I mean, the data's right there. It's understandable how we are where we are. The question is, what do we do next? Certainly, another poll that we did in a recent webinar, most of the industry feels like the industry's short of funding. I don't think we can expect too much more from the government, from the taxpayer pool. And as well as that, the taxpayer pool is going to continue to be very, very closely monitored in terms of margin. So it's not going to be the answer to commercial reality, achieving a commercial reality. We need to look for other sources of revenue, and if that doesn't come from a combination, I'd really like to know what are the other ideas, and that's what we're going to discuss a little bit more next month. But over to our panel, Lucy, Russell, Wendy, Jason, thanks so much for giving up your time and sharing your thoughts. And what we want to do in this first question is really just looking backwards to what's brought you to this point, planning for FY24. What's been your experience with your budgeting and with your preparations, really getting ready for this continuing change year and a year of uncertainty in some ways. What's been your preparation like to this point? Lucy, do you want to kick off?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. I guess like many, the last 12 months has probably the greatest focus has been about understanding the detail in the change and reconfiguring our business. Certainly the back of house side of things, you referenced before, someone had a full-time staff member. We equally have a full-time staff member who is helping us to keep abreast of it. The other part of our process has been really evaluating our existing facilities. So we made the decision to close and sell one of our sites based on, as Tyler said, it was no longer fit for purpose for the emerging consumer group. But also looking at our technology. So looking at the increased reporting, the increased focus on the commercial side of the business and our need for much more business analytics. So a huge investment in technology to sort of course correct and make sure that we are trying to future-proof ourselves as much as possible. And a huge effort on workforce. Clearly, that's been an issue for everybody, and trying to really get that employee value proposition right, so that we're messaging the values of the organisation to meet the needs of those people looking for work in this industry.
How confident are you with your budgeting? That the forecast and what you can see for the next 12 months is realistic?
Well, interestingly enough, I've been at the organisation since January last year, and for the last few years we haven't had a budget because it's just not been practicable to manage a budget. We've put a budget in place this year. We are optimistic, but we've got big caveats around. There are so many assumptions we've made that until they're sort of 6 months in, we won't be able to really test them. So I'm optimistic. I wouldn't even put money on it right now because I just really don't know.
Thanks. All right, thanks. Russell, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Andrew. We're a smaller provider, privately family owned with 2 homes, so we don't have the luxury of those corporate overheads. It requires. Yeah, I'm personally involved in a lot of the reform and compliance measures, but the issues that we're focusing on primarily, workforce is the main one, because I find that the efforts around securing permanent staff can help mitigate the cost of agency. So most providers are affected by heightened agency outlays over the last 2 years through COVID and isolation of staff, and then an attrition of workforce And it's about, I'm very optimistic from the workforce point of view, because with these increase in funding, which as Tyler pointed out, goes directly straight through the budget in and out. It's not a profit center, but it's actually a means of attracting new staff who may be new to the aged care sector. So I'm pretty hopeful in that respect, but I'm very mindful of the fact that that will be a large injection of people not from an aged care culture. They will need training, they will need understanding around dementia care, and that's something that I'm reinforcing with my management team, is that we need to be investing in a supportive workplace culture for all these new arrivals, and also sufficient training to make sure that they feel confident to do the job. The other issue that we're working on is from July last year, we started implementing additional services whereby we charge additional fees to our resident for mostly hotel services which go beyond the schedule of specified care and services. And that's an additional revenue stream that would not be present in the budget that Tyler put up earlier, and just goes to supplement the income. A lot of it is spent in investing in equipment and new staff in order to deliver that. But the idea is that if you can roll it out for a high penetration through your resident cohort, then that will start to bite after a while, start to have an impact on your revenue. The other big issue is just around the December governance implementation of things at the board governance level, around how we as a private provider are able to manage what I perceive to be a conflict of interest there between what the government has legislated and what meets the interests of private organisations. Some of these ideas seem a bit more applicable to large not-for-profit, or any not-for-profit, or large listed corporate entities, but yeah, private entities have a bit more complicated structures, so the practicality of them is challenging. That's all I'll say at the moment.
Thanks, Russell. Yeah, a couple of really interesting points. Just a quick side note that we have produced a couple of free videos on AN-ACC, short videos for induction purposes. So if you've got a lot of new staff coming in and you want to give them put a quick video into your induction process, which sort of gives them a very high level overview of AN-ACC and the assessment process, those videos are free and they're available on our website. Thanks, Wendy. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We're a middle-sized regional not-for-profit provider. So first I'd say I'd agree with some things that have been said. For instance, Andrew's comment about change management. To do a little bit all the time is certainly what we've done really since 2020, actually. And that really has consisted of, firstly, we made a decision to rebuild and majorly upgrade our largest facility. And even though we didn't know COVID was coming and probably a lot of these other things that were coming, we were in a position to be able to fund that mostly ourselves out of reserves. And even though that has added to all of the challenge that we faced, what we will be seeing, by early 2025 is a really beautiful state-of-the-art complex, which gives us much more scope in regards to flexibility of RAD payments. We've also moved our RAD payments up, even though it's not totally straightforward to do that in a regional area, but the market value of homes in this Albury-Wodonga area have gone up and haven't gone back down significantly. So there's certainly some evidence there to rest on when looking at RADs. And I can see that probably this year we'll move them up again into the 550, 600 mark probably. based on what's happening in the market, but also the need for that additional revenue. One of the things in planning that rebuild and refurbishment was to put in capacity for fee-for-service options such as a la carte menus and etc. So there's, you know, new service areas included in that new build and renovation, which will enable us to do that. And that was a deliberate strategy. I guess the other major area that we've really focused on are two. One is workforce, and I'll just come back to that in a minute. But systems is the other area. We've invested a lot. We're fortunate we were successful in business improvement grant at one point, but we've invested a lot in end-to-end systems. I still think that the sector's got a long way to go, or rather vendors in the sector have got a long way to go to meet the needs that we've got. And I'm very impatient for the government to bring in the kind of regulatory compliance for software vendors that we require, because data, as we know, is king. And until we have systems that can produce seamlessly, it's very, very hard not only to meet compliance, but to produce data that you can rely on for decision making. And too many vendors in my view, take what the government put out in regards to what is required and then make up their own minds how they'll design their system around that. But regardless of that, I think it has helped us to come through an incredibly difficult time to increasingly have systems that we can rely upon and that are scalable and can, even with some workarounds, still give us the data that we need. We restructured quite a bit in our management team scenario to cope with what we saw coming in regards to the AN-ACC and care minutes compliance issues, but also the need to manage our revenue from AN-ACC by continuously, and I mean continuously, meeting regularly and assessing our incoming residents and our current residents and trying to find that optimum spot. And we're still in the infancy of doing that, but I guess one thing I would say about those changes, AN-ACC and the care minutes, I welcome the information that we now have, and also that we had to produce budgets for the coming year, because it's just a more scientific scenario than it ever used to be. And I think to be able to look to that and look ahead, and I think we can be more confident now. Like one other speaker said, I mean, we'll probably recast budgets in September, October, somewhere around there, just after we've got an idea of the impact of what is occurring. But generally speaking, I'm pretty optimistic that we have turned a corner. I still think that there needs to be a short-term injection of funds until the user pays scenario picks up, which it will. I have no doubt about that. I don't know if anyone saw the reports on who owns most of the superannuation investments in this country, but it's the baby boomers, in case you're wondering. So I think the government's got to unlock that somehow, and it just has to happen. So I guess the other area, workforce, like everybody, and particularly in the regions, I cannot begin to describe how horrific that has been. And like many people, we have spent huge amounts on overtime and agency staff, no doubt about that. but we had a philosophy of not just meeting our care requirements and our duty of care, but to gradually move to a position where we were meeting our care minute requirements, and we didn't have to make big jumps to do that at any one point in time, and that has paid off. We're starting to see recruitment ease up a little bit, but we also planned investing in migration recruitment. So we've got about 26 staff due to come and settle in the region for a minimum of 2-year period. That'll start happening in October. And that will enable us to stabilise our rosters, which in itself will allow us to predict some cost decreases, we hope. So it's not all bad, but I think we're still implementing change bit by bit by bit. Yes, people are tired. Yes, we see the fatigue. There's no doubt about that. And that's why we invested in that staffing issue, so that we can allow our people to gradually take some leave, me included. And that's really important. So that's a bit of a summary of kind of how we prepared to be where we are, and also looking at the way forward.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks. Jason.
So, sorry, I just had to unmute myself. I think the big issue with the 2023-2024 financial year is that the Independent Health and Pricing Authority have not done a proper cost of care study yet. So the increases we've seen in the ACFI, the hotelling supplement, and the indexation have been based on previous data, meaning our previous ACFI data. It's not based on care data. And so the biggest, I've been in the industry 17 years, and I think the Independent Health and Pricing Authority is the biggest thing to happen in the industry in the time I've been in it. And the reason for that is they've always just rudimentarily just determine what funding needs to be in the sector by looking at everyone's profit and loss, and looking at the top performers, saying everyone else that's out of that are losers, and these guys are winners up the top. Throughout most of that history, that has been determined who was at the top by the people who clawed the most out of their ACFI, manipulated the most, and had the lowest staff ratios, which is not what I call the best management. So it's been a flawed methodology. The funding for this financial year has been based still on that flawed methodology, and for the first time for a very, very long time, I don't know if it's ever happened in the history of aged care, but the cost of care for the Independent Health and Pricing Authority will be determined by them. And you can see why there's a task force being rushed together quite quickly, and that is because I think they know what the results of that study are going to come back like, and they know they have to pay for that, as well as the increased ratios that are coming up. So we've got a period of time now for the next 12 months where we're still kind of navigating on that flawed methodology for determining funding. We've had a lot of changes to our income structure with the increase, but then clouded by the requirements with the ratios, and also the 15% pay increase and what covers what. And you can do the best modelling you can do, but we all know modelling doesn't equal reality. And so we've done the best we can with our budgets, and we've tried to budget and be accurate. However, at the end of the day, I think it's just going to be a year of uncertainty, and when there's uncertainty, we can sit around and get worried about a boogie monster, or we can do our best to figure out what's coming up, but there's boogie monsters in aged care, and as a manager you can get pretty stressed about that if you just start focusing on all the uncertainties in the future. So for us, and we've grown quickly. We've had a lot of providers join Respect. We've got 21 homes now, 6 joined in the last 12 months. I'd say 4 of those joined because of the uncertainty and the stress of the uncertainty. And so I feel like the providers that are bailing out now, it's not even sometimes financial, it's not clinical. It's actually just the amount of uncertainty and having to deal with that and the stress. So if we can minimise our stress, I think it helps to get through an aged care. And I feel like the people that are left at the end of this, it's going to be not just the next 12 months. We've got a lot of changes coming up, 2 or 3 years worth of changes. The people that are left at the end of that, I think there's going to be some supply and demand for those people, but also for the organisations that are left at the end of that. I think there'll be a lot that don't make it. So for us, we are just focusing on what we can control. That's workforce at the moment, like everyone else said, is a big issue. Putting lots of solutions and strategies in place to minimise that. It's the expense management and getting some EBITDA inconsistency. Because we've had so many takeovers, we have got some inconsistent EBITDA going on. So it's just benchmarking, and we're also able to benchmark off our other sites. So we know this site performs well in that area. There's absolutely no reason the other sites can't. So really, we're just really focusing on the internal consistency with our expense management, doing the things we can do with the AN-ACC, although that's going to have limited use after 1 October. Although before then, it's very important to keep focusing really hard on the AN-ACC. Additional services, I think Russell mentioned that. I think it's important for providers to be getting that revenue stream, and also there's been additional expenses, as you've mentioned. We can't really help those in the quality space, the commission and the approach. It's just you have to have quality systems in place and auditing in place. So that's really our 12 months.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. All right, let's move on quickly and have a little bit of a look at this roadmap that's been produced from, and it's quite a busy roadmap. And it's the first time that the department's published since the new government sort of published a new roadmap, or I think so. And it's it's kind of moving away from some of the documents that came out after the Royal Commission a couple of years ago. So this is almost reprioritized or adjusted priorities, and there's some interesting new boxes, and it's not particularly easy to read that graph. So we've but some of the interesting things, obviously up the top here, the regulator's now become the financial regulator as well. It's taken over all of that staff that was being used to do financial regulation, and now that all belongs in the same group, which is interesting when you think about the care minute cost, the cost financial sustainability argument, and obviously providers who are really meeting or exceeding their care minutes might be suffering financially, and vice versa. So it'd be interesting to see how the same regulator balances those concerns. There's this interesting one right here, which is around enrolled nurse care minutes and about them being published with the star ratings on My Aged Care. Now, what I found interesting about that is I haven't heard a great deal about that. And why that's happening. I think it's interesting. I think it's great. It could be in a response to, some of the concerns around ENs not being counted as RN minutes and publishing that as well. If you're struggling with your RN minutes, then you can show your EN minutes, or maybe it's, the way that the Commission's going to approach EN minutes as a mitigation of missing out on your RN minutes, which they've talked about. But just the fact that it's been announced that it's going to be published in October, and not really heard too much about that. Another one that's interesting, I thought, was the food and complaints advice hotline. Complaints and advice hotline being established. So another more direct way to get food complaints information through. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on food and nutrition coming out in the new standards. Obviously, provider operating, ACFR, all of that sort of stuff goes through the mandatory minutes on October the 1st. Then if we skip forward, another one that I thought was interesting is this dollars going to care publication of residential providers' financial information on My Aged Care. So you kind of referred to that a little bit, Russell, I think, and it's in the governance sense, but also the publishing of financial information probably falls in that same area of concern for smaller private operators. But also what they're going to publish. So are they going to publish the percentage of funding that is being spent on care, for example, as a metric? I don't know exactly what that means, but I just thought that was interesting there. Obviously, the residential aged care places being assigned to people, following that model and removing the need for better licenses, and the better license process will be formalised. There's some home care and home and CHSP information updates there, but really the one that I wanted to highlight the most was this block here, where all of these boxes are kind of the same size, but they have varying degrees of impact. And there's a run of things coming in July, and obviously if they probably won't all meet this July timeframe. They're probably being put in there as a placeholder, and even our conversations with the department, they kind of acknowledge that. But this is what they're aiming for, and they are, and certainly in our conversations with the department, they're unapologetic about the pace of change. They feel like the Royal Commission was pretty clear, and the recommendations were pretty clear, and the industry has to move, has to change, has to improve, and so they will continue with this pace of change. But these boxes are all pretty similar size. But if you run down them, you've got the new regulatory model, the quality standards, the accommodation framework review, and the new Rights-Based Aged Care Act. So there's some really, really significant things all landing in July nominally. Then, of course, 2:15 and 44 minutes coming October just after that. So one of the most concerning things I think about the October is largely, with everything else that's been going on with the wage case and concern around how that's going to be funded, and really the detail of that didn't come through until late in the last financial year. And most providers we're speaking to are still waiting to see how that lands in the first couple of months in the P&Ls of this financial year, and as it all gets passed through and it gets funded with the new price. But what is going to be the impact of that in this financial year is still a very big question mark. But if the minutes are required on October the 1st, the department's messages to us have been, you might get a couple of quarters, but if you've had a transition year to go from the funding last October to the care minute requirement in October this year, there's going to be an expectation that you are meeting those care minutes pretty quickly. There's not going to be a lot of grace period after the 1st of October when you've had the grace period in this 12 months, despite everything else that's been going on, particularly because the next 12 months is designed to be a ramp up to 2:15 and 44. So there will be an expectation. And I think the number that was given to me was that the quarter on quarter QFR data from the last quarter, that the industry went up 1 minute. So that there has not been, at least through the middle of this year, calendar year, there has not been a move towards care minutes on average, at least in the last QFR data. The average of the industry went up by 1 minute. So I think people have waited and understand that, and October is going to be a big rush and into the new calendar year. But you need to be on a trajectory towards 215 minutes over the next 12 months. So there's a lot of work to do. And we would argue that a significant amount of that work is in getting the systems right, like you were saying, Lucy and others, Wendy, but that the new funding model is a recovery model. So you're only entitled to 100% of your funding. There's no ACC where you can bring people up and then re-enable them and then keep that funding and then use that money to cross-subsidize, which is widely occurred in the industry over the last 10 years. And it takes a while to unwind that. Like you were saying, Wendy, I think, the short-term funding to allow that business model to change is going to be interesting. Somebody quoted to me that the average inheritance every year is $67 billion in Australia. So there's $67 billion worth of inheritance money handed down from the aged population to the next generation every single year. So there's a lot of money there, but that recovery model requires you to be diligently on top of your AN-ACC reclassifications in line with your rosters, because every day that you're not adjusting it, you're losing a day's money. And that's, you know, that's revenue leakage these days. That's what it looks like now. It's how much can you get theoretically and how much are you achieving practically? And that's going to take constant diligence, systematic, system-based diligence to make sure that you're recovering every dollar of funding that you're entitled to almost every day in line with the care minute expectations and the rosters that you're delivering. So I just wanted to go through that. They're in the slides that you'll get when you receive the email. There is a easier to read version, which we think is, you know, just will highlight some of those things and a little bit easier to read. But you know, here are some also some key points that you'll be able to take away if you review that after this session, where we're looking at you know, a number of key milestones there that you can have a look at, and a number of ways that we can help you if you need help. So really, that's, guys, that's what the panel for the panelists, that's what I really wanted to present, to give you guys a view of what else is coming up in the next 12 months you may or may not have thought of. So maybe not just thinking about your own organizations, but looking at thinking about the industry and some of those things we just talked about. Which ones of those do you think are going to have the biggest impact on the industry, or be the greatest challenge in the next 12 months? There's certainly a lot up there. I'll bring the slide back up if you want, but we'll go backwards now, Jason, if you want to start.
Sorry, I'm reading myself again. Thanks for going backwards, because I was just going to look at your slide, but that's fine. Look, I think the biggest one is the ratios. Our staff costs have always been the biggest expense we've had. So ratios and how we manage that, and how we manage that in relation to the AN-ACC and the different classes. We're doing modelling internally to see if it's actually worth increasing the AN-ACC, and we've always focused on occupancy and ACFI and increasing those two metrics, and that's what makes a home perform well. But it's almost to the point, well, it is to the point where we're modelling whether we are better off not focusing on increasing the AN-ACC and more focusing on meeting the minutes, whatever they are, because and that means having a flexible roster, because the AN-ACC increase means the staff cost increased. And really the only benefit, when the AN-ACC first came out and the care minutes first came out in their relation, I worked it out backwards based on the classification and how many dollars per minute each level of classification would be, and it was $1.12 for all of them. And so they'd worked it out backwards as well. So couldn't get any advantage there by going to a classification. The only real advantage is the margin on top of this, on top of the care minutes. Really, though, I haven't done the modelling on the adjusted care minutes, so don't take my word for it. But I guess we're assessing whether we bother about increasing the AN-ACC, or whether we just make our rosters flexible so that no matter what the care minutes are, we're meeting those care minutes. And theoretically, that applies for occupancy too. The occupancy going up and down, and the roster going up and down with the occupancy. I don't think you ever want to muck around too much with occupancy or not put any focus on it, because you don't want to, you want a return on your capital that you've invested as well. But I suppose those are all the things that we're looking at, all the little dynamics and changes, and what's the best approach to that from 1 July. So I'd say, to me, it's definitely those ratios 1 July. Also, with those ratios, you'll note the star rating is 3 stars if you meet the ratio. I think you'd have rocks in your head if you're going to go for 5 stars. I think you'll go broke. I don't think they're going to fund the 5 stars. I think there's a disconnect there between the Commission and the Department of Health. I don't believe the Department of Health will be funding you to reach 5 stars. And if you try to achieve the 5 stars with your ratios, I can't see it being a very viable organisation. So I guess those are the considerations that we're looking at.
Thanks, Jason. Russell?
Yeah, echo those sentiments. I mentioned it in a chat reply there as well, but to me, given the large sunk costs or ongoing costs with running aged care homes, the goal has always got to be maximum occupancy, 100% as near as possible. And I think there was a slight adjustment to the minutes allocated to AN-ACC classifications in line with the May budget announcement. But I mean, that would make lower classifications slightly more preferable to higher classifications. But at the end of the day, you've got a workforce deployed that you've got to keep employed. And I don't think it's really beneficial to be skewing your admissions decisions to lower classifications, because there's just going to be this unrelenting demand for the higher classification care, and you'll need to cater to that to maintain occupancy. So it's the higher occupancy level is always going to deliver better outcomes.
Yeah, I guess the whether you can actually provide the resourcing for that higher occupancy. I mean, the department may argue that if you take the occupancy and you take the funding, then you need to provide the care minutes, and if you can't, then you need to work backwards and not take the resident, I guess. But yeah, they did adjust the RVUs in the budget process. They're going to go in October, and I think. I think that's a really good example of how they will continue to adjust RVUs. So if you continue to apply a bit of an ACFI mindset, which is maximizing classifications and just trying to find the staff, not only will that be expensive, because if you can't find the staff, you're obviously paying penalties and agency rates to meet those rosters. But they can also adjust those RVUs. So when they see a skewing of the classification distributions, they can adjust the RVUs and bring them back into line for the care minutes associated with that. And certainly in these adjustments, we've seen some big winners and some big losers. So people who are really skewed towards the higher classifications, those care minute, those RVUs have gone up significantly. So those people with the portfolios that look like that are going to have a significant cost jump if they're meeting those care minute requirements. So yeah, it's going to continue to be a little bit of a moving field. And again, a reason why managing this in a system becomes important, because forecasting how those impacts actually calculate out and balancing those things are going to be increasingly difficult. Wendy, I think I skipped over you accidentally, so because I don't have the picture in front of me. Why don't you go next?
Well, three areas I think will have the biggest impact. One that we've just talked about, which is absolutely that care minute scenario. But I do think that in that area, and that's where we've made the biggest changes in regards to our skill base, I suppose, in that we deliberately moved people into positions where they're across the data, across the organisation, rather than how it used to be in ACFI, where they were confined to a facility. So, for instance, there's a much bigger communication between the admissions people and the clinical people and the finance people and me. In reviewing regularly those care minutes, our current cohort and our admissions, but also relating that to star ratings, so that you hopefully land with flexible rostering, you land in a position where, and let's face it, you have to create your own margin. They're not creating your margin. So, where you land with a reasonable margin and a reasonable star rating, which would be a 3 or a 4, I would assume, not a 5, obviously. So that area, I think, is going to continue to bite us and continue to challenge us. But I feel more hopeful. If they get if IHACPA gets the price a bit closer to the real cost of care, that'll be really good. I don't know about that though. We'll just wait and see. The other area I think is in home care. The supported home program, I think, is something. It's one of those bogeymens you can worry about given what was first suggested by the department, and that if you've got home care, that's the area that's making a surplus, albeit a diminishing one. But I just that's very uncertain, very unknown at this point in time, and I think that's a big worry. The other one I've been watching closely is what I mentioned before. You can see that the aged care digital strategy is being worked on, and if you've been to any of those workshops and whatever, that's what I was saying before about the provision of end-to-end systems and what the responsibilities of software providers are if they're marketing to this sector. And I can give you so many examples about money that's just gone down the drain in regards to purchasing those sorts of systems. So I think those three areas will impact quite hugely, certainly on us and on the sector. But I'm not as what's the word, feeling hopeless as I was. I think it's been an incredibly awful and hard period for everybody, and to just see a little glimpse, even though if I look too hard at that map, I'll lose all my positivity, I think, but just to see a little glimpse of hope is something. It's something. I've been in this sector for 30 plus years, and honest to God, this is the first time I've seen a bit of a glimmer of hope, that some people are getting the message that we might get actual reform in the system, that we might actually get direct care funding, which is worked out on the true cost of care. But I don't know, I could be Pollyanna.
Sorry, talking on mute. Thanks, Wendy. I think that for us, from our point of view too, that the model does present some significant opportunities once it all settles down and people get used to managing it more systematically. Over to you, Lucy. Any thoughts? Quick thoughts?
I look very, very similar to my colleagues. I think something that hasn't been mentioned that worries me is when we look at the new Act and the quality standards, like the regulatory framework, there's language in there like trauma informed, and that concerns me because we're talking about a workforce, whether you're a registered nurse or a carer, at no point in your training are you taught about trauma informed. Trauma informed is a very specialist area, and I think we run the risk of trying to throw something in with good intention, but is actually probably a 10-year rollout to actually change the qualification set. I have my background is many moons ago, counselling and trauma, working in the trauma space, and I think just putting the language in there is like taking a pin out of a grenade. It's a very dangerous statement without being really clear what you mean by it. I think certainly from an intention perspective, if we look at the changing demographic of those we're caring for, absolutely there's a need to have a better skilled workforce, and I think all of us would put hand on heart to say that we're investing to improve skills, particularly with the prevalence of dementia and cognitive impairment. But that language worries me when it starts being introduced with not, I'm not aware of any consultation where that came up sort of in the early days. Likewise with care minutes, we mentioned before, we've got a targeted role. We've actually introduced a business support officer in our finance team, and that is really the analytics. So we'll be very carefully monitoring it. But what it's also doing is starting to give us a lens of what is actually the target AN-ACC classification, so that we can manage in a much more sort of managed process, rather than suddenly having the ups and downs as we have the vacancies and looking at new residents. And I think that's also about resetting expectations of the health system. So the skeptic in me says, if the funding is better off for lower care, is this in fact government's approach to push the more acute into the hospital setting, which is a shared funded responsibility between the states and the Commonwealth? But that's the skeptic in me. So I think, there's a lot of work to do around that, but also looking at the regulatory synthesis, like how do we make sure that we are not just being given the detail about these individual things, but what is the synthesis? How do we actually embed that into practice in a way that is purposeful and meaningful? I think the last thing, I'm really excited. I am optimistic about the future. The reality is challenging, but I'm really optimistic about the future, because to get a new act is, if nothing else, is going to give us some clarity. We've all lived through the challenges of a changing demographic and the schedule of services being debated. What should we be providing? What is covered? What isn't covered? I think it's going to be important to have clarity, but also to have a rights-based framework which actually puts the consumers and their rights and their, how we can actually, partner with consumers differently. So overall, I'm really optimistic, but there are some significant challenges that we need to address. And as I've said all along, if we can have more time with the detail, it means we can plan better. And that's been one of the major failures, I think, of the reform agenda, is giving us the detail in a timely way so that we can actually operationalise it and actually put it into our business models and put it into practice in a considered way, rather than having to rush at the last minute and give it our best shot, which, if you've been in the industry for as long as many of us have been in, it's an educated shot, but not everybody's been in the business this long. And if we want to bring new blood into this industry, we need to actually support people to understand the complexity of this industry.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Excellent points. No time for questions in the chat. Just a couple of quick ads at the end. If you want to take action and get yourself from where you are now to fully understanding AN-ACC and how you're balancing your rosters, this is the program for you. It's 3 months, go to woe, get you sorted. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and not sorted for October 1, this is a program. If you need to do something, this is all available in the slides when you get the email. If you don't know what you want to do and you don't want to spend any money and you want here's 2 things you can do that don't cost any money. The star ratings analysis report will tell you a lot about where you sit with your star ratings compared to others and what you can do about it. And the benchmark your facility, get onto the get your Medicare data into the pool and get a sense of where you are relative to your peers, including those RVU changes that we just talked about and how that's going to affect your finances on the 1st of October. These are 2 free reports that you can get from us that will help you understand where you are better. And next webinar, let's talk about user pays. Let's talk about accommodation. Let's talk about where the money might come from. What are the other ideas we might have? So join us next month. Jump on that registration. And just lastly, thank you so much, Lucy, Wendy, Russell, and Jason. Thanks for giving up your time. It really makes a difference. These webinars are a lot more interesting listening to you talk about it than listening to us talk about it. So thanks again for joining us today. Thanks for everybody on the line who joined the webinar today, and we hope you found it useful and continue to find them useful each month. Any ideas for topics or anything like that, please put them in the chat. Any feedback, always welcome. Thanks very much for your time.